James, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Ados. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And it's a pleasure that we have been able to invite you today. And welcome to this pre-launch webinar on the upcoming WHO technical statement on guidance on hormonal contraceptive eligibility for women at high risk of HIV acquisition. I know you have already received the statement, which is embargoed until it is released. And the release will be on 2nd of March. And you have also received a list of frequently asked questions. So first, to introduce myself, my name is James Carrier. I'm the coordinator for the WHO team that works on human reproduction. And that team, one of the areas that we work on is family planning. And for this webinar, as I've said, that the documents and the discussions that we'll have will be embargoed until 2nd of March, when we'll be able to release the guidance. And we are also planning to have very brief presentation, and we'll have a presentation from my colleague who led the process of development of this guidance, Dr. Marilyn Garfield. And following that presentation, I'll give a very brief overview of our communication activities. And following that, we hope that we'll be able to have some discussion. You can ask the question. If you raise up your hand, then the moderator can be able to unmute you, or you can just type a comment or a question on the chat box. Just for the guidance of the people, in terms of the procedures for development of WHO guidance, the guidance statement itself will be the basis on which we'll be discussing. At this point, it has already been finalized and will be issued as it is presented. However, we would really appreciate your input on the frequently asked questions, which we have opportunity to revise before 2nd of March. And just to acknowledge the various countries that are participating in this webinar, to acknowledge participants from Botswana, from Congo, Ethiopia, Kenya, Lesotho, Malawi, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, Nigeria, Philippines, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and also from Zimbabwe. And in case you are from a country and that it wasn't mentioned, please type on the chat box so that we can also acknowledge you. And also to acknowledge our UN colleagues from WHO headquarters here and from the regional offices, and also colleagues from UNAIDS, from UNICEF, and from UNFPA. It's really a pleasure for us to have you here with us. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Marilyn Garfield, to take us through the presentation on the new guidance.
Thank you very much, James. As we wait for the presentation to appear, I would like to thank the members of the Guideline Development Group and the external peer reviewers whose input shaped the guidance statement that you see today. I'd also like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Drs. Sharon Achilles, Lauren Thaxton, Maria Rodriguez, Chelsea Polis, Caitlin Kennedy, and Roger Chow for the instrumental presentations they gave during the consultation that we convened in December. And also, lastly, I'd really like to thank Dr. James Chiari for the support he's lent throughout this process. So let's go to the next slide. Next, please. Great, thank you. So for more than 20 years, WHO's Department of Reproductive Health and Research has produced the Medical Eligibility Criteria for Contraceptive Use, or as we like to say, MEC, Guideline. On the 1st of June 2015, WHO issued the 5th edition of this guideline. The MEC is an evidence-based guideline that provides more than 2,000 recommendations on the safety of 25 contraceptive methods for women with certain medical conditions or personal characteristics. And in particular, as we will discuss today, this guideline includes recommendations on contraceptive eligibility for women at high risk of HIV infection. Next slide, please. Although some of you may already be familiar with the format of the MEC recommendations, I would like to take a moment to briefly review the meaning of the 4-category scale that is used to indicate eligibility. Category 1 indicates a medical condition or characteristic for which there are no restrictions on the use of the method. Conditions classified as Category 2 indicate that the method can generally be used, but careful follow-up may be required. Category 3 conditions are those that require careful clinical judgment and access to clinical services. And Category 4 conditions are those that present an unacceptable health risk, and the method in question should not be used. Now, in certain situations, separate recommendations will be made if eligibility differs according to whether the woman is initiating or continuing to use the method. Lastly, in settings where resources for clinical judgment are limited, the 4-category scale can be simplified into 2 categories. Thus, women with a condition or characteristic that's classified as a Category 1 or 2 can use the contraceptive method, whereas if she has a Category 3 or Category 4 condition, she should not use the method. Next slide, please. When the 5th edition of the MEC was, within the 5th edition of the MEC, there are no restrictions on the use of combined hormonal methods, such as pills, the patch, the vaginal ring. Neither are there restrictions for the use of progestogen-only contraceptives, such as pills, injectables, and implants, for women at high risk of HIV. Women at high risk of HIV can also generally use the levonorgestrel-releasing IUD. And also, when we speak of progestogen-only injectables, we mean DMPA, which can be administered intramuscularly or subcutaneously, or NET-N. And this Category 1 recommendation is accompanied with a clarification that says that women at high risk of HIV who are using progestogen-only injectables should be informed that available studies on the association between progestogen-only injectable contraception and HIV acquisition have important methodological limitations hindering interpretation. Some studies suggest that women using this method may be at increased risk of HIV acquisition, whereas other studies have not found this association. And we have additional information also in this clarification. So this, before the start of the consultation, this was the recommendation for women at high risk of HIV for hormonal contraceptives in the medical eligibility criteria guideline. I also want to indicate that the red circle that you see indicates the methods of contraception that were reviewed in the December consultation. So we did not review any evidence or revisit the recommendation for the levonorgestrel IUD. So this recommendation remains a Category 2 for women at high risk of HIV. Can we go to the next slide, please? Following the release of the 5th edition of the MEC in 2015, WHO became aware of new data that was published since 2014. Consequently, WHO commissioned and updated the systematic review that summarized the evidence supporting the 5th edition's recommendations. This systematic review, which offers a synthesis of the body of evidence published through January 15, 2016, was published as open access in the journal AIDS on the 9th of August in 2016. To briefly summarize, the review identified 10 new studies, of which 5 were considered to be informative, but with important methodological limitations. During the preparation of the systematic review, a meta-analysis was conducted among studies that presented higher quality data. And through this meta-analysis, the review reports that the risk of HIV acquisition among women using DMPA compared with women not using a hormonal contraceptive was a hazard ratio of 1.4, with a 95% confidence interval around this estimate ranging from 1.2 to 1.7, suggesting a statistically increased risk in HIV acquisition among women using DMPA. Also, to accompany the release of this publication, WHO issued a statement announcing that an expert review group would convene later in 2016 to examine the links between the use of various hormonal contraceptive methods and a woman's risk of HIV acquisition. Also, I'd like to note that the review concluded that an important step for WHO would be to determine whether its current guidance needed to be reconsidered. Next slide, please. During the consultation, which convened in December, on the 1st and 2nd of December 2016, a group of experts, or as we call the Guideline Development Group, convened to review new evidence on the risk of HIV acquisition among women using hormonal contraception, and where appropriate, they were asked to revise specific recommendations issued in the 5th edition of the MEC. The review process followed the standards and requirements specified in WHO's Handbook for Guideline Development. In addition, to provide a supplementary context to the discussion, a variety of presentations were made. So, for example, the group was presented with results from a decision analysis that modeled the competing risks of unintended pregnancy, maternal mortality, and HIV acquisition risk. The results of a brief survey among country programs and how they interpret WHO recommendations on contraceptive eligibility for women at high risk of HIV was also presented. And lastly, we organized a panel of program managers to gain their perspectives on the topic. In addition to these contextual presentations, there was a summary of the systematic review's findings and a review of biological plausibility and potential mechanisms that may link hormonal contraceptive use and HIV acquisition. Following these presentations and a great deal of discussion, the Guideline Development Group considered the following factors in determining the recommendations. They considered the quality of the evidence as presented in a grade table. They also considered the values and preferences of contraceptive users and of healthcare providers offering contraceptive services. They weighed the balance of benefits and harms of contraceptive use. They considered contraceptive choice, equity and human rights, acceptability of recommendations in contraception, and also the feasibility of implementing any recommendation. Next slide, please. For combined hormonal methods, the pills, the patch, the vaginal ring, and the combined injectable, this grade table presents the studies that the group reviewed. The GDG considered evidence from 11 cohort studies that were deemed to be informative, but with important limitations. These studies represented data from more than 43,000 women. No studies, we were unable to identify any studies on the use of the combined patch, vaginal ring, or injectables. So the data presented here represents contraceptive pill users. 10 of the studies in this table found no statistically significant association between the use of a contraceptive, oral contraceptive pill and risk of HIV acquisition. However, there was one study that reported a marginally statistically significant risk. But the overall quality of this data was considered low to moderate. And the adjusted hazard ratios reported among these studies ranged from 0.66 to 1.8. And none of the studies reported a statistically significant increased risk of HIV among women using combined hormonal contraceptives compared with women not using hormonal contraception. Next slide, please. As a result, the GDG determined that the current MEC recommendations, as they're presented in the 5th edition of the MEC for combined hormonal methods among women at high risk of HIV, should be upheld. Therefore, the category for all of these methods remains a Category 1, indicating no restrictions on their use. The evidence, but I will note that the evidence statement that you see there has been updated to reflect newly available published evidence. Next slide, please. So now I will discuss progestogen-only contraceptives. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to summarize the data that's available for progestogen-only implants, meaning levonorgestrel or etonogestrel implants. The systematic review identified 2 small studies that assessed levonorgestrel implants that were considered to be informative, but with important limitations. And neither of these suggested an elevated risk of HIV acquisition, although the risk estimates were imprecise, as you can see in the width of the 95% confidence intervals around these 2 estimates. As these 2 estimates are less than 1 or 1.6. And the 95% confidence interval includes a null value, indicating no statistically significant increased risk. Next slide, please. I apologize for the busyness of this slide, but this slide presents data that the group considered for progestogen-only injectables. And when we at WHO talk about progestogen-only injectables, we're considering DMPA, either intramuscularly or subcutaneously administered, and norethistran and Ante. As you can see from this table, there was data available from 13 observational studies of either of these methods. And of these 13, they were considered to be informative, but with important limitations. Together, the data from these studies continues to show some association between the use of progestogen-only injectables and risk of HIV acquisition, but it remains unclear whether these results are due to a causal relationship or methodological study limitations. I'd now like to draw your attention to the blue arrows that are on the right side of this slide. They point to the adjusted estimates across the studies. I'd first like to go to the blue arrow, the higher blue arrow. And this one points to the adjusted hazard ratio that was pooled across the 9 studies that looked at HIV acquisition risk among women using DMPA versus women who were not using a hormonal contraceptive. we can see in red that the adjusted estimate was 1.4, with a confidence interval ranging from 1.23 to 1.59. And the I-square value indicates that there was low heterogeneity amongst these studies. This estimate here shows that there is a statistically increased risk among women at high risk of HIV, of acquiring HIV, if they're using DMPA, compared with non-use of a hormonal contraceptive. Next, I would like to discuss the following arrow, which points to the adjusted estimate for women using northisterone and enantate compared with women not using a hormonal contraceptive method. And here we see the pooled estimate for HIV acquisition risk is 1.15, and the 95% confidence interval includes the null value. It includes 1, suggesting that this estimate is not statistically significant. And lastly, the very last row presents data from head-to-head comparisons, where data on HIV acquisition risk among women using DMPA was compared with the acquisition risk among women using NET-N. And one cohort study and one individual patient data analysis contributed to this. And what we see here is the adjusted hazard ratios range from 1.32 to 1.4, and the 95% confidence intervals for each of these estimates reach statistical significance, suggesting that perhaps HIV acquisition risk is higher among women using DMPA compared with women using northisterone and enantate. I'd like to move to the next slide, please. Additionally, as is noted in this statement, a systematic review of the literature was performed both among qualitative and quantitative data on contraceptive users and providers' values to understand their preferences, views, and concerns regarding contraceptive methods. And for this review, our colleague looked at studies published between January 2005 and October 2016. No language restrictions were set, and many databases were reviewed. They identified 206 studies that met the inclusion criteria, and rigorous procedures were followed to prepare the systematic review. Unfortunately, no studies were identified that solely focused on the issue of women's values and preference around the potential increased risk of HIV acquisition associated with specific hormonal contraceptive methods. However, what was identified from this review is that there are very important key themes about women's preferences and values around contraception. Across all the studies, the review found that women's values and preferences centered on the wanting to have options, wanting contraceptive methods that are easy to use, wanting to have contraceptive methods where there's few side effects, and they also want effective contraceptive methods. And also, somewhat, depending upon whether certain contraceptive methods are available in the woman's setting, will also determine their values and preferences. And they also reported in various studies that the counseling offered by a provider and the opinion of their social networks influence their decision making. Next slide, please. In addition, and what is also unique in this review of the data, we asked our Guideline Development Group to consider a variety of factors beyond the quality of evidence. So as we showed in the earlier slide, we saw that the evidence for DMPA and NET-N was considered to be low to low moderate quality for the primary outcome of interest, which is whether or not the use of these methods increased HIV acquisition risk. We also asked them to consider in coming to their decision the balance of benefits of using a contraceptive method versus any potential harms. And they agreed that contraception is a life-saving intervention and that progestogen-only injectables are highly effective, reversible methods that are widely used in areas where maternal mortality and morbidity are very high. And although uncertainty exists in the scientific data regarding the association between progestogen-only injectables and any possible increased risk, they felt that this possible increased risk really needs to be outweighed by the very real risk of maternal mortality and morbidity associated with unintended pregnancy. They also noted that for individual women, this risk-benefit ratio will be different, and it's essential that informed decision-making be utilized with women considering progestogen-only injectables and all contraceptive methods for that matter. So they agreed that the benefits of use outweighed the potential harms. For values and preferences, we heard that women strongly want to be involved in informed decision-making process. They prefer choice in methods. They want full information regarding benefits and harms and want to make a final decision in conjunction with a provider, so a shared decision-making process. We also noted that contraception is unique from other medicines because a woman's needs and preferences and method characteristics will vary between individual women and across a woman's lifetime as well. So common themes of contraceptive preferences include discrete, minimal side effects, long-acting, reversible, and easy to use. And women who use progestogen-only injectables generally like them for these reasons and feel comfortable using them after counseling. So as a result, the group decided that offering women the choice of a range of methods is important for both their health and from a human rights perspective, and that programs should support optimizing informed contraceptive choice and the availability of a wide range of contraceptive options. It was universally agreed that HIV is a life-threatening illness and a major global epidemic, and unintended pregnancy is a very common problem globally, and the risks associated with unintended pregnancy are highest, where maternal mortality and severe morbidity are most common. So with both of these priorities, these are both priorities for public health. Hormonal contraception and HIV is a public health priority. Regarding equity and human rights principles and standards from existing WHO guidelines on human rights and contraception were drawn upon when the Guideline Development Group was deliberating. And these included such issues as non-discrimination, availability, accessibility, acceptability, quality of services, informed decision-making, privacy and confidentiality, participation, and accountability. So the recommendations from WHO's human rights guidance for contraception were paramount principles in the decisions that the Guideline Development Group advised to WHO. Additionally, the feasibility of implementing any recommendations on this topic. We discussed in great detail the importance that there needs to be clear communication from WHO on this topic. It was underscored repeatedly by representatives of affected populations, member states, and program managers that participated in the Guideline Development Group meeting. They also agreed that the prior WHO guidance in 2012 and then in 2014, which included a clarification statement with the MEC category rating, was often overlooked and poorly understood. With this feedback was incorporated into the updated guidance. So we recognize that it's imperative that clear guidance is essential for implementation. Lastly, groups at WHO also consider resource implications. Now, because the MEC focuses on the safety of specific contraceptive methods for women at high risk of HIV or other conditions, opportunity costs and resource implications were not formally assessed during this meeting or during the recommendation formulation, since costs of contraceptives may vary widely throughout different regions in the world. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, to help inform the discussion, we benefited from a review of plausible biological mechanisms that may help explain why or whether or not use of a contraceptive method may increase acquisition risk. We reviewed, we noted that progestogens, which can be natural or synthetic, are responsible for the efficacy component of contraceptives, and that progestogens actually impact many aspects of human physiology. And progestogens, there are many different progestogens, and they each have unique binding affinities to steroids. So, for example, medroxyprogestogen acetate, which is a part of DMPA, binds to particular glucocorticoids, which do influence immunity, immune reactions in humans. Now, while animal studies show epithelial thinning of the female genital tract when DMPA is used, we don't have such data on from humans. There's also been postulation that perhaps DMPA may affect the human microbiome, such as vaginal flora, but unfortunately right now, at least currently, this is not largely supported by available data. Now, there is limited data that may suggest that progestogens may enhance HIV replication and increase HIV susceptibility markers in the genital tract, and they may impact immune response, but the data is extremely limited. And our expert who informed us on this discussion really pointed to, and we continue to hear from other fora, that more precise measurement of actually which progestogen type is being studied, the concentration of that progestogen, and the mode of administration is sorely needed to understand whether or not there are biological and immunological effects of DMPA and HIV acquisition risk. Next slide, please. With all of this, therefore, the Guideline Development Group came to the following conclusion. As you can see on this slide, for women at high risk of HIV, women may use without restrictions progestogen-only pills, the levonorgestrel or etonogestrel implant. Both of these categories of contraceptive methods remain a Category 1. However, they did decide that injectables, whether DMPA intramuscular, subcutaneous, or norethistron enanthate, should be classified as an MEC Category 2. Also, very importantly, this recommendation is accompanied by a clarification which states that there continues to be evidence of a possible increased risk of acquiring HIV among progestogen-only injectable users. Uncertainty exists about whether this is due to methodological issues with the evidence or a real biological effect. In many settings, unintended pregnancies and/or pregnancy-related morbidity and mortality are common, and progestogen-only injectables are among the few types of methods widely available. Women should not be denied the use of progestogen-only injectables because of concerns about the possible increased risk. Women considering progestogen-only injectables should be advised about this possible risk, about the uncertainty about whether there is a causal association, and how to minimize their risk of acquiring HIV. Next slide, please. Therefore, in conclusion, For women at high risk of HIV, WHO continues to recommend no restrictions on the use of combined hormonal contraceptives, progestogen-only pills, or progestogen-only implants. And women at high risk of HIV can use DMPA, IM or subcutaneous, and NET-N. These methods now are a category 2. And when we came to this conclusion, we were thinking about optimizing the rights of women and girls for contraceptive choice and informed decision-making. And we realized it's imperative that clear communication and full informed choice is needed, and that the earlier recommendation had not led to the intended goal of informed decision-making. So women should not be denied the use of progestogen-only injectables. However, they should be advised about the possible increased risk of HIV infection and about the uncertainty of whether there is a causal association or not. And as we all know, consistent and correct use of condoms, male or female, is critical to protect against both sexually transmitted infections and HIV, and to prevent HIV transmission. Next slide. Now, what are the implications for programs, policies, and healthcare providers? WHO believes programs can and should continue to offer all methods of contraception to women at high risk of HIV. WHO resources are available to complement and support these recommendations, and we provide the examples in the statement. We also underscore that it's important to offer comprehensive contraceptive and HIV counseling to everyone equally, and that counseling on contraception is a core component to support informed decision-making and informed choice. It's also critically important that high-quality family planning and HIV services are integrated, and that this is an essential strategy to optimize the reproductive health of all individuals. We urge national programs to expand upon the range of available family planning and contraceptive methods in their settings. Next slide. So to conclude, WHO remains committed to continually review its recommendations in the MEC on contraceptive eligibility and safety. And we strongly support the need for further research to address the two twin epidemics of HIV and unintended pregnancy. And you'll see here the statement in English. It will be available in French and shortly in Portuguese. Next slide. Back to you, James.
Thank you very much, Marilyn, for that very informative presentation. And what I want to do now is look at some of the communication activities that will be engaged in following this dissemination, and partly because we would really like to partner with the countries and also with our UN colleagues to ensure that the rollout of this new guidance is smooth, and also that we are able to pass the correct message to both the users and to the program managers. And just to remind everyone that if you would like to ask a question, you can be able to lift up your hand and your mic will be unmuted. And also you can type in the chat box a question. So some of our plans, of course, the first point of communication is this pre-launch webinar that we are having now with our colleagues in the country and also with our UN colleagues. This will be followed in about another 1 hour in another similar webinar with some of the stakeholders in contraceptive provision and supplies globally. And the reason we had this pre-launch webinar is to ensure that you are prepared for when the guidance is released officially. You have been able to prepare the responses to the questions that will be asked, and that this does not come to you in an unexpected manner. We have also a set of frequently asked questions, and as I pointed out, we would really like input or questions regarding the frequently asked question, and in the next slide I will go through those so that we can be able to discuss that. At the time of the launch of the statement, we will also have a web story which is really targeting a lay audience to be able to interpret for them what is contained in this guidance, and this web story will be posted on the WHO website. Of course, we'll use our social media to communicate with our various colleagues. The other area is that, as we have said, this webinar has been in English, and we are hoping very soon to hold a webinar in French for our Francophone colleagues so that we can share the same information. In due course, we anticipate that we'll be holding several webinars on this issue from here WHO and also from the regional office. And these webinars will be recorded and will also be available for those who would want to listen and get more information. We'll also be having country follow-ups, mostly through our WHO country offices and also through UNFPA and our other H6 partners that are well placed in the countries to ensure that we provide the family planning programs with the support required to eventually be able to implement this guidance. And finally, also our other various partners who are involved in contraception provision services. So these are the communication activities that will be going on. We also welcome you, please, to contact us in case you have any challenges in communicating the guidance, or if you just want to update on the activities that you are doing in terms of promoting these guidance. So next slide. Looking at the frequently asked questions, we have come up with a set of questions that we imagine often come up regarding this guidance, and we have about 16 of these questions. I will not go through each of the question and its response. You have the copy you can review, and you can ask questions, and you can also email us any further input that you have. But just to remember that these documents are embargoed until the release of the guidance. But the questions cover three main areas. One is, what is the change? What is the change in guidance? And that there has been a change, and what is the change? And this, I think, Marilyn has gone through in great detail what has changed in terms of the guidance. The other area that the frequently asked questions cover is the issue of why this change has happened. Why at this time has WHO decided to revise the guidance, and the process. The other area is the process. What was the process followed? So that is on the change of guidance. The other area that the frequently asked questions cover is what do we expect from a programmatic and service response. So for program managers, for policymakers, and service providers, what is the expected response? And this is very important because we do not want that this change in guidance results in an inappropriate response, either from policy or from programs or from service providers. And just to highlight what Mary Lynn has already mentioned, that we would like that all methods continue to be offered to women at high risk of HIV infection. We would really like to emphasize the issue of shared decision making in contraceptive use and the special attention to be paid to women at high risk of HIV acquisition. And the importance of continuing to avail the HIV prevention strategies and also for STI, and the importance of expanding the range of available methods. And the last issue is on research. And what are the outstanding research questions? And here we emphasize that here in WHO, we'll continue to monitor the publications of new findings, but we particularly encourage research in two areas. And because there's been a lot of observational studies, which we feel, because of the limitations, may not be able to shed further light on this topic. Randomized clinical trials to provide more information about possible causality of the observed association, and also research that clearly elucidates women's preferences and values in this process of contraception decision making. So those are the areas. I've seen that there's been a number of questions, and I will call upon Mary Lynn maybe to read out the questions and then respond. And while she's responding, we will note if anybody else raises up their hand or posts another question. I think we still have about 11 minutes of, to go. And then during this time, we can be able to respond to the questions.
Okay. Thank you, James. Right now, I am going through the list of questions we've received, and I'll try to respond to them in the order that we've received them. So the first question asks, what were some of the limitations that were noted in the review of the evidence? I can briefly say that prime limitations in the study evidence is, first of all, that they're observational, that they did not come from randomized controlled trials, and as such, the control for potential confounding factors that may mix any associations observed is not as rigorous. So, for example, the measurement of condom use among women who are using methods is oftentimes either poorly reported or rather inaccurate. Also, the measurement of actual use of the contraceptive method is oftentimes not very clear. So those were some of the key limitations in the body of evidence, and then also the fact of continuation, discontinuation of the contraceptive methods. So it's really difficult to ascertain whether or not any risk of HIV acquisition is actually resulting from the use of the contraceptive method or not. As far as the next question goes, let's see, another question is, how is condom use to be promoted among women who prefer to use injectable contraception? Well, just to step back, this consultation really just addressed safety of the methods. But what we continually state in our guidance and also in our other supplemental material is that these hormonal contraceptive methods do not protect against HIV or sexually transmitted infections, and that if there is a risk of either of these, the woman couple is strongly encouraged to use condoms. So as far as the mechanisms for how to promote, this consultation didn't address that, but we do have counseling tools. But in no way do we say that condom use should not be promoted. Condom use, if there is a risk of these infections, condom use should be promoted. For the next question, we're asked to comment on possible implications for countries that have high HIV incidence as well as high DMPA uptake. I want to thank the person who asked this question, because this is really at the heart of all the deliberations that we had in early December, is how do you address these two competing issues? And that is really why our Guideline Development Group, they weighed so many different factors, and yet still the evidence is pointing that women should not be denied progestogen-only injectables, but that they need to have an open discussion and shared decision-making, and it's really for them to decide what method of contraception they want to use. The next question is, are there any updates on whether the effective DMPA is compromised when women are on ART, and whether because there have been reports of women on DMPA and ART getting pregnant. Well, this topic was actually not part of the discussion, and we didn't review evidence on this topic. I can say that the MDC does provide recommendations on this topic. We reviewed the data, pharmacological and clinical data, in 2014, and we've recently had an updated systematic review. And what we do, we have yet to change our guidance. So currently, women that are using DMPA are able, irrespective of the antiretroviral therapy that they are on, they are eligible to use these methods. So at the moment, we don't have data to suggest that there's reduced efficacy on DMPA associated with DMPA use and ART use. For the next question, we're asked, service providers often share that it's difficult in terms of providing information related to risk of hormonal contraception among high-risk women. And do we plan to have specific guidance, a guidance package for service providers in terms of counseling while providing the information related to risks associated? Also, many thanks for that question. We actually, as James, I believe, may have mentioned or alluded to, we do plan to develop some more communication materials, because we recognize that what you have before you at the moment is just a statement, and it was prepared and is written in a way that meets WHO Guideline Review Committee requirements. However, it is true that perhaps providers would like additional information, so we do plan to prepare additional communication materials. And thank you very much for that question, because we definitely recognize that this is a very important need. The next question is asks whether we looked into the interactions between ART and hormonal contraception in this particular review that we did in December. So just as I was mentioning, that question was not discussed. We do have a systematic review. It's now open access on this topic, so we'll find a way that we can share this with everyone. But no, we did not look at drug interactions for this particular consultation. The next question is it possible to provide separate recommendations for DMPA and for norethistron and enantate? Again, thank you for that question, because that was something that the group really pondered. And in the end, it was the Guideline Development Group agreed that currently, on the data that's available and what was discussed, etc., that on a precautionary principle, for the time being, DMPA and northisterone enanthate are the same. So they did think about this issue, and there was a lot of discussion and disagreements among the group, but for the time being, the recommendation is category 2 for both of these formulations, injection formulations. And for another question is there any interaction between methadone and DMPA? And thank you for the question. I have not, we did not consider this question in our consultation. I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately. And let me see. Okay, and then I think the last question we have is, someone suggested it would be helpful if there could be some counseling tools that you could get the counseling tools we were just talking about, and we will definitely endeavor to, perhaps, I'm not webinar savvy, but we will figure a way so that we can share the materials with you. But I do want to point all of you that are on the call that our guidance statement, if you look on, I believe it's one of the last pages. Yes, if you look on page 19, there's a box, and in that box we've got some web links to materials that may be useful for you and your colleagues or in your settings. I think that's, if there are any other questions?
Yeah, thank you, Marilyn. I think we have come to the top of the hour. We are just about a minute to go. And thank you, colleagues, for joining in today. We really appreciate. We also appreciate highly the questions. And we would also love that if you have further questions, as you look through the statement or through the frequently asked questions, please do email us. And as you go through the frequently asked questions, one thing to note is that some of the responses are repetitive, and this is done intentionally because we imagine that the users will not be going through all the questions, but the way it will be put on the website, people will have the opportunity to click on specific questions and get the answer for them. So thank you very much, and please do have a good day.